Yeah, sorry, I was taking notes as you were saying.
Fidgety. Can I have one steak bite before we start? Hopefully it doesn't get cut in my teeth. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Oh, it's huge. Did you hear John Romachuk and Corla getting married this weekend?
Yes, I did. It's cute.
On the plane, it was like all their wedding party, and people were.
Really?
Yeah, it was awesome.
That's cute. Good for them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's a social.
Mm-hmm. Gonna be a big one.
Yeah.
All right, we're live. Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Rick with Explore.org. We're bringing you a special live chat as the brown bear cam season in Alaska's Katmai National Park winds down and polar bear season in Churchill, Manitoba picks up. Today, we're going to talk about the similarities and differences between brown bears and polar bears, including diet, hibernation, rearing cubs, and conservation status. Plus, we'd love to hear from you and take your questions, which you can leave in the comments section on Explore.org. Or in the chat window if you're watching this on Facebook Live. We're joined by Elisa McCall, Director of Conservation Outreach and Staff Scientist at Polar Bears International, and as well as Mike Fitz. He's a former park ranger at Katmai National Park and current Explore Fellow. Welcome, you guys.
Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
For having us.
Sure. Elisa, will you tell us a little about the mission of Polar Bears International?
Sure. At Polar Bears International, our mission is to conserve polar bears and the sea ice they depend on, really. So we do this through a mix of research, education, and advocacy, and want polar bears to roam the Arctic sea ice for many generations to come.
And Mike, will you give us a little recap of what we saw this season on the brown bear camp at Katmai?
Oh, well, to sum that up in a few sentences is kind of difficult. That's the first difficult question of the chat. So at Katmai National Park, the season of plenty for brown bears is ending right now. What we saw throughout the summer was salmon begin to arrive in June. The bears really, from that point forward, were feasting on fish. We saw a lot of fat bears throughout the summer, a lot of mothers and cubs, including one mother bear with 4 spring cubs, and she was seen on the webcam, I think, just a couple of days ago. And then right now we're starting to see bears dispersing away from Brooks River as they migrate to probably towards their denning sites.
What can we expect to see this season on the Churchill polar bear cams, Elisa?
Yeah, so we're really excited. I just landed in Churchill today, and for anyone that has watched us before, you know that this is not my usual setting. So we're currently in town at what we call the Cable Shack. It's kind of the brains of the operation. What you're seeing now is Buggy One, where we will be next week. And so we plan to officially kick off polar bear season next week. So check us out Monday or Tuesday. We'll be out. BJ Kirchhofer, Director of Field Operations, he's right next to me now working on the network. So we'll get her rocking and rolling soon. There are polar bears out there. People have been spotting them. So we're really excited to bring them to you really soon.
Great. Yeah, we're all really excited. This is such a kind of a different thing than most of us ever really get to see. So it's always a pleasure having you, Polar Bears International, every year.
Yeah, it's pretty special.
So today, as noted, we're talking about the differences between polar bears and brown bears. So one way we can start is with their habitat. Though Churchill and Katmai are about the same latitude, they have very different climates. What are the differences in those climates and why? And what effects do they have on things like behavior and diet in the bear species? Mike, would you like to start with this one?
Sure. Katmai National Park's located on the Alaska Peninsula. It's about 300 miles southwest of Anchorage, Alaska. And it's in a place that's between really 2 oceans. It's between the Bering Sea to the west and the Pacific Ocean to the south and east. So it's very heavily influenced by air masses moving across the ocean. And while it is Alaska and it can get cold there, it doesn't get nearly as cold as what they have in Churchill. So the habitats are a bit more temperate, it seems like, from, and Elisa, correct me if I'm wrong, than what you find in Churchill. And then the winters just aren't as cold. I mean, you look at the coastlines in Katmai, and while sea ice can form there, it's not extensive. Certainly not like what it sounds like happens in Churchill, Manitoba.
Yeah, absolutely. Churchill itself, it's such a unique ecosystem here. We've got the mixing of a tundra, a boreal, and a marine ecosystem. So the polar bears that come on land in the summer here have a really kind of different situation. And it does get quite warm here in the summer, actually. It can hit plus 30 degrees Celsius. At that time, of course, there's no sea ice. So the bears are hanging out sometimes on the beach, and it's like super funny to see a polar bear on the beach. It's really different. But yes, in the winter, things do cool down, and we are already seeing that. There's snow and ice on the ground already here. And as soon as that sea ice starts to form in the next, hopefully, 4 to 8 weeks, those bears are going to head out on the ice as soon as they can. And absolutely, it can get down to easily minus 40 and the minus 50s with wind, no problem up here. And polar bears are just so well adapted to that environment that they're excited for the cold. We almost can notice a change in their behavior as soon as the temperature starts to dip around 0. It's almost like they perk up. They know food's on the way soon, and they're about to head back out into where they really want to be. But it's a pretty unique situation that we have them all congregating on land right now, waiting for that ice, and so we get to throw some cams on and watch them with you guys and see what they're up to before they leave us for the winter.
Great. So physically, how are they adapted to the ice? And then we'll talk about how that they're adapted to land and rivers of Katmai.
Sure. So yeah, polar bears are what we call a very specialized predator. So they're very, very well adapted to the Arctic and don't do so well in other environments. There's many examples. Some of the common ones are, of course, they've got very thick fur. So polar bears have 2 layers of fur. They've got a thick downy layer close to their skin that kind of acts like a sweater. And then they've got these longer guard hairs over top that's almost like wearing a raincoat. And that fur really helps them as they're walking in the Arctic cold, helps them from the wind. Their body fat better insulates them when they're swimming. So they've got a body fat that's several inches thick. Ideally, they're as fat as they can be all the time. And that also helps them float when they swim. They have short ears and a short tail to prevent sea ice loss. They've got a beautiful, smooth, curved around head. They're very sleek in the face. And this is a design that kind of helps them get in and out of seal holes better. And you can see there their very sharp teeth and very sharp claws help them grab their seal prey, which is their main food, the ringed and bearded seals up here in the Arctic. So very sharp. They got a lot of sharp pieces on them, these polar bears. And that's really to get the slippery, squishy seals out of the water and up on the ice and then tear into them really. So this poor little cute seal here coming up in a seal hole. A polar bear will wait by that seal hole. Yeah, right? Looks so good. So polar bears are very, very patient. They'll wait by that hole for a long time. And when a seal comes up to breathe, eventually they'll pounce on it and pull it up. So they've got, of course, an excellent sense of smell that helps them smell prey around. The bottom of their feet is kind of sticky. They have what we call papillae, little bumps that gives them some grip, kind of like winter tires grip the ice, and then furry pads on their feet too to keep their feet warm. So that and other adaptations, just makes them such an Arctic marine animal. It's pretty cool.
Mike, do brown bears need such specific adaptations to live in the more temperate forested areas?
Their adaptations are more of what you would consider to be advantageous for an animal that's a generalist omnivore. So unlike a polar bear that's very specialized for a certain habitat, brown bears are wide-ranging across a wide variety of habitats. So you can find them from Western North America all the way through Asia and into Europe. So they're almost like a whole Arctic or subarctic species. And the bears in Katmai are well adapted and have learned to feed on salmon. That's their most important food resource. Although we saw in a photo just a moment ago that they'll eat almost anything that they can, including vegetation. Vegetation can be a very important part of a brown bear's diet, not only in Katmai, but also especially in other parts of North America where they don't have access to as much meat like salmon. So they still have big teeth. They still have big long claws. They're very powerful animals, and they rely on body fat and fur like polar bears to stay warm. But overall, their diet and their behaviors are more in line with an animal that relies on a variety of food sources, even though in Katmai, salmon are the most important food resource for bears.
And I should add, I love comparing these bears because it brings up so many good points. Polar bears' digestive systems have also changed from the brown bear ancestor. Polar bears digest fat so much more efficiently than they digest proteins and vegetation. So while they're also a bear and will eat anything, because bears just love to eat, polar bears don't get the same amount of nutrition and calories extracted, basically, that it doesn't do them as good as it would for brown bears, these terrestrial foods. So polar bears really, we sometimes call them lipivores because they are so dependent on fat. But on the cams this coming fall, you will definitely see them eating kelp. And, last year we saw them eat a meadow vole on camera, which is pretty exciting. So they're definitely snacking. There you go. There's one eating kelp. So they're definitely snacking when they can, but it's just not doing as much for them as maybe it would for the brown bears there. Yeah.
especially when they become large adults too. With brown bears, you can make a living on vegetation if you're smaller. And overall, when you look at like the population of brown bears across North America, if you are surviving mostly on vegetation, you just can't grow that big. So if you're a polar bear and you're getting to be, you know, what is it, 600 kilos or something, you know, crazy big like that, a a diet of vegetation just can't cut it for you. You can't eat enough and digest it fast enough. And the same thing happens with brown bears too. The largest brown bears are the ones that have access to the most fat and protein resources, and that happens to be in coastal Alaska, like Kodiak Island and Katmai National Park.
And it makes so much sense. You think of human bodybuilders aren't getting that size off of garden salads. So yeah, it just comes down to calories. Totally.
Can we expand a little bit on, Mike, we've talked about in this season how brown bears need to fit a year's worth of diet into spring and summer. Is that the case also with the polar bears, Elisa?
In a way, yeah, maybe not quite as restricted, but there absolutely is a feast and famine for polar bears. So the summer really, is almost no eating for these bears here. Now they will get onto the sea ice this fall and over the winter, and they will be hunting, but food is not as readily available. So polar bears also do have one window of time where food is hyper abundant, and this is in the spring, usually March, April, May, when seals are pupping. And so seals have their babies on the sea ice, and then they're protected by these little snow caves. And after they are a few weeks old, they're basically these naive little fat popsicles. The one you're seeing there is a bearded seal. And so polar bears, we call it hyperphagia. They go into hyper eating mode, and they've got all these seal babies to basically consume. This is also how mothers with cubs, when they emerge from their dens, they time that emergence so that these moms with their new babies are hitting the sea ice when there's this abundant, relatively easy food source. And so in this short window of time, we will see polar bears double their weight, add hundreds of pounds of fat to their body, and that's really their big eating time of year. And that body fat will be the main source of their sustenance for those months that then they'll come on shore in this region. In other parts of the world, polar bears can hunt for longer periods, but always for them, the spring is definitely, I'm sure, their favorite time of year.
And that's fascinating because for brown bears, springtime is really a season of starvation. They come out of the den in sometimes, in March or earlier. It's not uncommon for a bear in Yellowstone to come out of the den in February. But in Katmai, bears are going to be coming out of their den later in the year. And when they come out, there's almost nothing for them to eat. So they're still surviving on a lot of that body fat through the middle and late stages of springtime until the vegetation starts to green and then the salmon arrives so they can get fat. And the bears in Katmai right now are just ending their hyperphagia season. So their metabolism is starting to slow down right now as they're preparing for hibernation. So they don't really, they get hungry in the springtime, but they don't experience hunger in the springtime like a polar bear does. And so that's a fascinating difference.
So now that their metabolism is slowing down, Mike, what does the future hold for the brown bears? They're as fat as can be.
Yeah, they're at their fattest points of the year right now. So they're going to be looking forward to a long rest inside of their dens and losing up to a third of their body mass over the winter. So they're going to be subsisting on the fat that they stored inside of their bodies throughout spring and summer. And bears in Katmai will dig a new den each year. So this is a photograph of a den on Dumpling Mountain, which is near Brooks River. And so it's just a big hole in the hillside that they end up excavating, and then they'll spend several months waiting out the famine.
And Elisa, are the polar bears at their thinnest of the year at this point?
Yeah, they would be at their thinnest at this point, most likely. And those bears that maybe had a great hunting season last year are still going to be in average shape at this point. And maybe some that didn't have so much of a great year are going to be even thinner. And it really depends. Historically, sea ice would be starting to freeze up around here by late October. And now we're seeing that being pushed farther. So It just kind of depends on how each polar bear is doing and the timing of the sea ice breakup earlier this year, and now the freeze up now. So, but yeah, this is almost reaching their point of kind of where they would have not eaten for so long. However, any females that may be pregnant right now, they are just going to be entering their dens at the moment. So they would have come off the ice last summer, entering dens now, and they're not going to come out till the spring, like we mentioned before. So they can go for up to 8 months without eating, and that's while they're giving birth and nursing. So those females may be, in lower shape by the time they emerge. And again, that's why they need that really easy food source when they do come out of their dens, because they must be hungry.
So let's talk about, I guess, reproduction. Do female polar bears, do they instinctually know that they're pregnant, and do they put more effort into getting fat so they can spend 8 months having not eaten? Do they put things like that? What can you tell us?
Sure, yeah. So female polar bears have this kind of neat thing called delayed implantation. And maybe, Mike, you'll have to tell me in a moment here whether brown bears have this, but they'll mate in the spring. And even if there is a fertilized egg, so a zygote, it doesn't implant in her until past the summer. And so we do think that if she does have this fertilized egg, that yes, there may be some sort of hormonal change, or maybe she does inherently know that she's pregnant, but there does seem to be a change where she does gain a ton of body fat. So whether she's eating more than normal or retaining fat more efficiently, not 100% sure. But when you see a pregnant female, you know it's a pregnant female. It looks like they're wearing like almost a costume of body fat. Like sometimes we call it fat pajamas. It's super neat to see how fat they'll get. And then if she is still fat enough by the fall, then her body will send the signal that, yes, this egg can now implant. You're officially pregnant. Go into a den. So they kind of have this delayed thing. If they're not fat enough in the fall, then that egg will get fleshed and they'll try again in the spring. So we do know that there is kind of a lower body weight limit that females can be. And right now we believe that's around 420 pounds is the smallest female we know that's given birth successfully. Luckily, hopefully they're more than that when they enter a den to be successful.
And with brown bears, they also go through delayed implantation. So that's another point of evidence for their shared evolutionary history. Female brown bears, though, can reproduce at smaller overall weights than it sounds like polar bears can. I don't think there's necessarily like a lower threshold, but but the threshold really more than anything probably has to do with body fat. So it doesn't matter if you're 200 pounds necessarily or 500 pounds, you probably just need sufficient fat reserves to be able to support the energetic burdens, the tremendous energetic burdens of raising offspring. So they'll have that delayed implantation. It sounds like the brown bear mating season is a little bit later than the polar bear mating season. At least in Katmai, the peak of the brown bear mating season is in June. And that's also a time of the year when a lot of food resources just aren't quite available. So it's neat that well, at least within the bears on coastal Alaska in Katmai, they don't have to necessarily have two competing things going on in their life. They don't. If the mating season were in the fall, when they're trying to get fat, they would probably be expending a lot of energy trying to find mates. At least the male bears would, and they don't really have to worry about those two competing interests, whether it's food or finding a mate. So they will mate in the late spring typically, and then they can spend the rest of the year just focusing on getting fat and building up enough energy reserves to survive winter hibernation.
That is smart. I do feel like the mating season for polar bears does definitely have some overlap with the big food season. So I bet that's a bit of a distraction for especially the males at that time of year. Mike, I do have a question for you. So polar bear milk is about 30 to 33% milk fat when cubs are newly born. So it's like kind of drinking almost whipping cream. It's so fatty to help these cubs grow fast. Do you know, the fat concentration of the milk that brown bears have by any chance?
It's fairly high. I can't remember the statistic off the top of my head. I'd have to revisit my notes. But it is fairly high. I don't know if it's exactly as high as a polar bear, but it's close to it from what I can remember. So it is very thick, has a very high fat content to it. So it is certainly not like drinking 2% milk out of the store.
Right.
It is a very, very heavy milk.
Mm.
So Lisa, would you mind giving us a little timeline again, since you mentioned the pregnant females are now going to begin denning. Are they going to miss the seal hunt this year altogether?
Pretty much, until the spring. So the average date of den emergence is about March 1st in this population. So the females that are entering a den, they're gonna be there right through the winter. They're not gonna have another really great meal until probably March or so. So it's a long time without eating. I don't envy them.
What are they eating in March?
It will be those seal pups. So
Okay.
for polar bears, that's their number one food source are these. We call them ice obligate seals, so seals that need ice. And in this area, that's the ringed and bearded seals. And so, they're heading to the ice. They're looking for these seals. And then hopefully, there's a bunch of pups available in March and April that are easy feeding.
And about how old are the polar bear cubs that emerge from the den at this point?
Yes. So we assign every polar bear that's born a birthday of January 1st, and that's an approximation of when they're born. So on average, when these cubs are emerging from their den, they're going to be between 2 and 3 months old. So they're so new, they're little. They're maybe around 20 pounds, give or take, hopefully a little bit heavier, but some are a little bit smaller. And they've just got these tiny little feet, and it's just crazy that they can keep up with their mom as she roams around the sea ice. So moms who do have these little cubs, we do see that they move differently based on years of tracking data. They move differently compared to other females because they just have to be more careful. They've got little babies. So they're going to stick a little closer to land overall. They're not going to do the big swims, which are really hard on, tiny polar bear bodies. So they're going to try to avoid too much swimming. They're going to stick closer. They're going to hunt kind of the easier stuff if they can. Yeah, because they're little. They'll grow really quickly, very, very quickly, because when they're born, they're only about a kilogram. So they're only about a couple pounds, if that. So they've really grown 10 times their size in a couple months, which is crazy. If you think of that in human terms, you could have a 7-pound baby be 70 pounds by, the time they're a couple months old. That would be insane. So polar bears do grow quickly, but they're still quite small when they do get on that sea ice for the first time.
Right, Mike, similar question. What are some of the differences between the brown bear cubs as they come out of spring cubs? Do they have more ability to hunt, or are they completely dependent on their mothers?
They're still completely dependent on their mothers during the first several months of their life. So they're born in the den, like polar bears, usually in midwinter. So I think if we were to assign a birthday for a brown bear, you can generally pick around February 1 or so. And again, it varies, but usually in midwinter is when they're born. And then they'll stay in the den several more weeks, nursing, getting stronger. When they emerge from the den, though, they still are quite small, and they're still highly dependent on mother. And they'll continue to nurse really as long as they're with mom. But the amount of milk that a cub needs decreases as it grows. And at this time of the year right now, if we're fortunate enough to see any mothers and cubs on the Katmai bear cams on explore.org, then you can probably see the bear cubs catching maybe their own salmon from time to time, certainly scavenging fish from their mother. But we're not going to see them nursing nearly as much as what we would see in the springtime. So that allows the mother bear to build up more fat reserves because when she goes into the den this winter, she's going to be surviving on her body fat, and her cubs are going to be surviving on their own body fat. So bear cubs going into their first full winter are not going to be nursing inside of the den. So that's only something that happens right after birth, only in those first few weeks after birth. But it's really neat to see bear cubs go through a period of maturation. And we see them, as they grow and age and they gain experience and confidence, that they're sometimes more bold. able to and more willing to investigate novel situations. When they first arrive at Brooks River, they're really just hanging on mom's haunches in a lot of cases, because mom seems nervous and then the cubs seem nervous. But at this time of the year, we definitely see the cubs showing a bit more independence, and that continues until they're weaned in the springtime. Usually, and that happens after they come out of the den at the beginning of their third or fourth summer in Katmai.
On average, how many offspring per season does each species have?
Yeah, so
Well,
for polar bears,
Oh, let's start with Elise.
go ahead, Mike.
Yep,
Okay.
go ahead. No.
Okay.
That's my job to say.
So polar bears have about 2 cubs. In this region in Western Hudson Bay, triplets used to be way more common, and now we're seeing more singles, but we can expect 1 or 2 usually. And they'll give birth about every 3 years. So polar bear cubs will be at their mom for about 2.5 years, then they'll be weaned, then mom will try to mate again, and then she'll try to have another litter. So we can expect maybe 2 new cubs per mom every 3 years if things go as planned.
Litter size in brown bears, at least in the Katmai population, averages 2 to 3 cubs per litter, although it can vary from anything from 1 to 4. There's actually some pretty good evidence of a litter of 5 near the park headquarters area, which is outside of Katmai National Park. No one really knows if those all belong to that mother or if there was an adoption event that happened in there. And adoption is rare in brown bears, but it does occur. But generally 2 to 3 is the average litter size for brown bears.
Okay, so Mike, would environmental or habitat variations, does that directly have an effect on how the average, I guess, litter sizes differ between the 2 species?
Well, with brown bears, how well fed you are often can increase or decrease how often you have cubs and also the size of your litter. So in brown bears, it's well documented that the fatter you are as a female brown bear, the more cubs you can have on average, and then also the frequency of your litters increase. So if it pays if you're a female brown bear to just eat as much as you can, because that's going to help boost your reproductive effort. And the energy that mother bears, polar bears, or brown bears are expending to raise their offspring is really incredible. Like Lisa said, a polar bear can go 8 months without eating and still raising cubs. I just can't fathom the amount of energy that they have to store within their bodies to accommodate such a tremendous energy load. That's quite an amazing statistic to me. Brown bears go through something similar, but not quite to that extreme. So yeah, it's really an amazing process that these animals go through.
Great. Relatedly, I'd like to talk a little bit about denning, but is there more about reproduction or cubs that you guys would like to bring up before we move on a bit? Okay.
Well, I love watching cubs learn. So that's one of those things that on the Katmai cams, we have a unique opportunity to experience, because we get to see a lot of the same bears coming back each year. And that allows us to see the learning taking place in these bears, from very small young cubs that maybe really have very little experience in the world to fully mature adults that know how to fish Brooks River. They know how to do it really, really well. And we see bears all through different life stages. So it's fascinating for me to sort of watch that maturation process take place.
I think that that's such a special thing about the brown bear cams that we don't really get on the polar bear cams. It can be much harder to tell individual polar bears apart, especially year to year. So I'm not sure if really, unless there was a really defining characteristic, if we'd be able to notice it was the same cubs in a second season come back. We can say that when we do see cubs around here and on the cam, it's pretty cool in the moment to watch them learn from their mom. And maybe brown bears are the same, but we'll see polar bear cubs exactly mimic mom's movements down to almost the footprints. They'll do everything she does. It's just pretty neat to watch. But we'll have to rely on our viewers' keen eyes if they, notice any individuals or any scars that they think they've seen before to compare back to really see if we're seeing the same individuals come back year to year.
And trust me, they'll try too. They do a pretty good job with the brown bear cams. So I think
Yeah,
that's a
we
task
do.
for all the viewers at home to help us out with that.
Totally.
This is a big help. Thank you so much, viewers. Lisa, you mentioned denning, the mother bear's denning. Is this different than hibernation?
Yeah, it's not true hibernation. And in polar bears, they are the only bears that will enter a den. And when Mike mentioned before that for brown bears, the cubs will go back in with their mother in the den in the winter. Polar bear cubs won't go back into a den unless one of them is a female and gets pregnant after she's 5 years old. So it's really only the pregnant females that will go into any sort of den. And while it's not true hibernation, an older studies in the 80s and 90s saw that a pregnant female's metabolism will drop a little bit when she's in the den and she's not excreting urine and waste. Of course, she's not eating. Her breathing does slow a little bit. Her metabolism reduces approximately 25%, I believe. But they don't go into like the full kind of deep sleep. And they'll give birth around January and then they're up and nursing and things like that. So it's kind of the only time we see polar bears in a den. And something, Mike, that you said that intrigued me was that brown bears will dig new dens a lot. In this area anyway, polar bears will reuse dens quite often. And that's actually one of the big questions we have about these bears is we'll kind of see these maternity denning complexes almost. There's peat along the riverbanks in this region, and we'll see multiple dens in a little area that seem to be reused again and again by different bears, maybe by the same bears. We're not sure if it's moms learning from their moms and then teaching their daughters or what it is, but there's a lot of reusal of dens, which is a pretty cool thing that we have to learn more about.
Oh, that is interesting. I know that some biologists have speculated in brown bears that they show some fidelity towards denning areas, and the geology and the habitat really in Katmai isn't conducive to a bear reusing a den. Usually those dens collapse each year, but it seems like bears will go back to an area where they know, hey, this is a spot that I can find a den. I can find the habitat reliably. I know where it is. Even though I may have to travel a few dozen miles to get there, it's worth it because I know I can find shelter for the winter ahead. It'd be interesting really to know whether or not, female polar bears show fidelity towards denning areas. And maybe that's something that they learn from their mothers. That's one of the speculative reasons why brown bears may go back to to a certain denning area. It could be because mom showed them, hey, that's where it is. Just like mom shows them where to fish for salmon sometimes. And they remember that and they come back as older individuals.
Absolutely. Yeah, we do think that must be part of it. We do know they have fidelity to broad sites for sure. And that's a good point about kind of the substrate the dens are in, because I believe that the reason polar bears are able to reuse these dens is that they are in the permafrost. So when they do dig a den, it's probably a lot more permanent and stable than it would be in regular soil. But of course, we are seeing the permafrost thawing more. We have seen some dens collapse in this area. And as that continues, it will be curious to see if these dens are being reused and reused again, or if new ones are needing to be built more often because of the changing substrate. So that's a really interesting point.
And Mike, do all brown bears den?
Yes, they will all enter dens on average. I should say that there are exceptions. On Kodiak Island, for instance, and that's only a few dozen miles from the Pacific coast of Katmai National Park. There are bears that are winter active there all year. So you will find some, not many, but some adult males that stay active. And now they're not active like they are in the middle of summer. It's not like they're out, chasing salmon or something like that. They're fairly lethargic at this time of the year. But the climate seems mild enough that they don't feel the need for whatever reason to go inside of a den. But when you look across age and sex classes of brown bears, whether it's an adult female that's pregnant or not, whether it's a subadult bear, those teenagers of the bear world that are just on their own for the first time, or if it happens to be, cubs going into their first full winter, all of those brown bears will den.
Elisa, will polar bear cubs stay with their moms until the mother dens after she's pregnant several years later?
They will stay with her, so she'll chase them away when she's ready to get pregnant again. So they'll be with her for about 2.5 years, and within that third year, they're with her in about March or April. She'll, we think, she basically strongly encourages them that it's time to leave and to be on their own. And then after that point, she'll be on her own. If a male were to approach her on the ice, there's a chance that male could himself scare away the cubs or potentially do them harm if he really, wanted their mother for himself.
Right.
So the cubs are usually long gone before the mother will re-enter a den that fall.
So we're a little more than halfway through the chat. I'd just like to reintroduce ourselves. I'm Rick with Explore.org, and we're having a polar bear and brown bear chat with special guest Elisa McCall from Polar Bears International and former Katmai Park Ranger Mike Fitz, who's now an Explore Fellow. And we're taking your questions. You can either type them in the chat window at Explore.org, or if you're watching the Facebook live broadcast, you can chat us there. And soon, would you two like to start taking user questions, or
Sure
you
thing.
have more that you
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, because we have several great ones that have come in. So one viewer has read that polar bears have such good insulation that they don't show up on infrared. Is this true? And do brown bears show up on infrared? Elisa,
So
let's start
polar
with
bears,
you.
yeah, polar bears do show up on infrared. They are definitely very well insulated, and it's easiest to see them on infrared in their faces, of course, where they're losing more of that heat. So we do have some folks that have used infrared to spot polar bears in the evening, kind of testing it out. It's pretty cool. And one of my favorite things about using infrared on polar bears in the winter is that when they're walking, the heat from their footprints will briefly also show up on the infrared at night, which I think is pretty cool.
Mhm.
And brown bears must be visible in infrared as well, because they're not as well insulated as a polar bear. They're well adapted to cold temperatures, but they probably lose heat in the same places that a polar bear does. So through their faces and their paw pads, especially.
I gather that polar bears are related to brown bears from which line they diverged. How long ago did this take place? They have
I'll
a
say
common
what I know,
Subject
and
to
it might,
debate, isn't it?
yeah,
Yeah.
I think it is subject to debate. So yeah, brown bears did diverge from polar bears. It's the polar bear's ancestor is the brown bear for sure. And I believe actually they diverged potentially from maybe an Alaska population hundreds of thousands of years ago. Mike, what you maybe have more up-to-date knowledge? There's a few different schools of thought, I think.
Yeah. I think it depends on what who you're talking to about it. I don't think anyone has definitively confirmed like this is the age where brown bears and polar bears shared this common ancestor, and then they just diverged from there. So it estimates range anything from just a few 100,000 years to sometimes several million years. One of the interesting things, and I think there probably are questions about this. We'll try to maybe answer those later on, but that they're so closely related genetically that they can still mate and produce fertile offspring. So it's rare, but it has happened. And actually, there's a population of brown bears within Alaska in the Alexander Archipelago, which is in Southeast Alaska. It's, and the brown bears there actually are, if you look at the maternal line, the maternal DNA, the mitochondrial DNA that's only passed down through from mothers to their offspring. Fathers can't pass that down to their offspring. That is actually more closely related to polar bears than it is to brown bears. So there definitely was some inbreeding between the two species, or hybridization between the two species there, and they're mostly just captured in those brown bear genes.
We have a few questions about these hybrids, actually. I'm aware that there have been instances of hybrids and wonder if the loss of ice packs that drive the polar bears to land will cause more interbreeding. Elisa,
Yeah,
do you want to field this one?
It's a really good question. So there were several hybrids spotted up in the high Canadian Arctic. And there was a lot of speculation about whether this was a result of climate change, is the habitat changing, and these bears are coming into more contact than ever before. So samples were taken from the bears that were available, and the genetic results were released last year. And it turns out that, at least in this case, it was kind of a one-off. It ended up being one female polar bear that maybe had a for or happened to be close to a couple male brown bears. So it was only one female polar bear mated with each of these brown bears in different years. And then those offspring mated with the same brown bears. So you kind of had this a bit of maybe an incestuous small family situation going on in one pocket of the Arctic. So we don't believe we'll see a lot more of this right now. It is possible that as the ice continues to change, and brown bears move farther north, as you know, they're generalists and may be able to take advantage of warming areas, that as these species come into closer contact more often, it could be possible we'll see some more hybrids. Right now, they're, you know, the little group of them that we thought was an indication was just kind of you know, a bit of a funny situation. And the hybrid themselves, there was also some speculation like, oh, maybe it's the new super bear. This will be the bear that overtakes the polar bears. But it was really not a great bear. It wasn't very well suited for land or sea ice. It was kind of in the middle. It was adapted to an environment that doesn't exist yet. And so it really wasn't that fit. So not, you know, not that great if it passed on its genes more. So yeah, really interesting situation up there though. Fascinating stuff.
Mike, would you like to expand on hybrids? Do you have anything to add?
Well, not necessarily. I think Elisa covered it pretty well. But actually, when I think about it, you know, she did touch up on a topic concerning like the fitness of, you know, any polar bear and brown bear hybrid, because they're going to be sort of, you know, in between these two worlds, the world of a generalist omnivore to one that's more specialized for living on sea ice. And even if you think about the claws of a polar bear, this is something that I didn't know until I started rewatching some of the live broadcasts for Polar Bears International recently, is that their claws are short and sharp, more akin to just like a beefed up black bear claw. So, and it helps them to grip sea ice. And brown bears, you know, they have much longer claws that are better for digging and grasping things, but not walking on ice. So those you know, when you combine those genes, maybe it provides the offspring or gives them a disadvantage when they're trying to exploit, you know, these different habitats. And it also depends on what they learn from their mother too. Elisa was also mentioning, you know, bear cubs mimic the movement of their mothers quite closely. We see this in brown bears and polar bears. So, you know, if you are a hybrid raised by a polar bear mother, you're going to know how to feed on sea ice. You're not going to know how to go onto the land and forage for berries as much and make a living that way. So bears are, you know, opportunists. They're very habitual in a lot of their habits. They're smart learners, and especially when it comes to food. If mom teaches them this is where you find food, that's where that bear is going to try to do it in the future. So it you know, if you don't have those specialized tools for sea ice, you may be at a disadvantage.
So those pictures of the claws and the paws are great because we have a lot of questions about kind of general physiology between the two. And we touched on some of them in the earlier part of the chat, but we might want to revisit those. I mean, that picture of the polar bear paw, it just looked massive and kind of flat. You tell us how that suits them? And are they actually bigger than brown bear paws?
You know, I don't know if they might be bigger than a brown bear paw. So they can get up to, you know, 12 inches across. They're the size of dinner plates for these big males. They've got, you notice the fur on the bottom of the feet helps keep them warm. They've got kind of sticky pads we call papillae, helps them grip the ice, along with the nice sharp thick claws that Mike mentioned also help them grip the ice. And actually their feet play a role in their mating system. When females are ready to mate, They exude a pheromone through their feet. Basically, they get stinky feet and they leave stinky foot trails along the sea ice, and that's one of the ways the males will find them. They'll sniff these smelly footprints and follow them along the ice for for a long time, which is pretty cool. But another reason their feet are just so big is that it helps them distribute their weight over a larger surface area. So you can get a really big polar bear, but because they have these big feet, their weight is spread out more on this ice, and they can actually walk across pretty thin ice, even compared to humans. If they really need to spread their weight out, we'll sometimes see them do what we like to call a polar bear starfish, where they'll kind of get almost on their belly, spread all their legs out, and kind of shuffle along thin ice if they have to. So they're just very well suited. That's close. Yeah, that's a very lazy starfish, maybe, but that's the idea, kind of thing. So, yeah, it's pretty neat to see.
Have you ever smelled one of these stinky footprints or stinky paws?
I personally haven't, and I should ask. I know the folks that did the study. I'm not sure if we could smell it or if it's one of these, very species specific pheromone, or maybe it would smell like barefoot. Yeah, like a polar
Okay.
bearfoot. I should ask. I have not smelled them myself, which is maybe that's a good thing.
The sense of smell of bears overall is really
Oh,
incredible. I mean, we see them at Katmai investigate things that really don't seem like they would be much interest to us, but they investigate the footprints of other bears, the scat of other bears, the urine trails of other bears. They're able to smell where a salmon was dragged on shore hours before and sniff around that area and detect the odors very easily. So it is really amazing that the bears are living through this sense of smell, whether they're on land or sea ice. I mean, that is probably the sense that they rely on more than anything else. They have pretty decent vision, but it's really their noses that they're seeing the world through. If that kind of makes sense, you can just wrap your head around relying on your sense of smell as much as you, or more than you would rely on your eyesight, and that's the way the bears sort of experience their world in a lot of ways.
Sorry to jump around here a little bit, but you just mentioned a fish and out on the riverbank. How do the bears make their living? And like some salmon is still left behind, and what parts of the salmon do they eat? And then Elisa, I'll ask you what parts of the ring seal do they eat and where the calories come from. So, let's start with salmon.
It does depend on how hungry the bear is, how much of the salmon they're going to eat. At the beginning of the season, when the bears have really been, starving for several months, they're going to eat as much of the fish as they can, and we see the bears eating the whole fish, maybe just leaving some of the bones behind or the entrails, but most of the time they're eating the whole fish. As they become more well fed as the season progresses, or sometimes in days when there's so much in the river, so many salmon in the river that they can't eat it all, but food is so accessible that it's just there and abundant for them. They'll do a thing that we call high grading. It's like a miner looking for the high grade ore. So a bear's currency you can think of as calories, and the way you can get calories most quickly as by eating a diet that's really high for a brown bear, a diet that's really high in sugars and fat. So sugars can be provided to you by berries, and then fat can be provided to you through salmon, especially parts of salmon like the skin, the brain, and the eggs. Those areas have of the fish hold a higher proportion of fat than the fillet. So, when you buy a salmon fillet in the store, you're actually getting a part of the fish that's less caloric, so to speak, than other parts of the salmon. So if you're in a survival situation, I like to say, don't ignore salmon eggs. So if you catch a salmon and it's a female and it has eggs, you got to eat those because they contain so much fat. So the bears will select for the fattiest parts of the fish when they are more well fed. But when they have access to fewer fish, then they're going to eat the whole thing.
Yeah, and this is again, it's such a nice mirror for the polar bear. It totally also depends for the polar bear how much of the seal they eat, depending on how hungry they are. If they are well fed and there's lots of food, they will just strip a seal's fat off. They'll eat the blubber and leave the meat some of the time. The one you're seeing here now, that was a hungrier polar bear who ate more of it and looked like it just left the tail there. So of course, yeah, they'll eat meat and whatever they can get when they're very hungry. But when it's really good eating time, they're just blubber machines, really. They're just sucking up the blubber. And then they're leaving this great pile of calories for Arctic foxes to come in and feed off of, or birds that are around to come eat. So when they do have leftovers, it's good for everybody. But also, yeah, calories are currency. I like that, Mike. And it's all about the fat for polar bears.
How are their hunting styles different, Mike? How do bears fish for salmon?
Brown bears and katmai have the opportunity to sort of wait for their food to come to them. When we see this at Brooks River all the time, especially at Brooks Falls when the salmon are migrating, bears will just stand or sit at the waterfall waiting for a salmon to make a mistake, get too close, get confused in some of the plunge pools, and then the bears can take advantage of the situation. They'll also scavenge for fish, especially at this time of the year when most of the fish are finished spawning and they're dying. Those carcasses will drift downstream, so bears will just kind of cruise along the river looking for anything that can't swim away. In populations of brown and grizzly bears that don't really have access to salmon, they will range across the landscape a bit more widely. Brown bears and katmai actually have some of the smallest home ranges of any brown and grizzly bears ever measured in North America. So some females have very small home ranges in katmai, especially compared to brown bears or grizzly bears in the Yukon or in the northern Rockies. So bears and katmai have it fairly good because they can wait for salmon to come to them, even though they won't eat a wide variety of other foods.
And then for polar bears, they have a few kind of foraging strategies, I guess. We do see scavenging, especially when they're forced onto shore in the summer. They'll kind of eat whatever's around. If they're really, really lucky in some areas, maybe there's a dead whale that they can snack on for a while. But when it comes to actively hunting, we see two kind of main different styles. One we call still hunting, and that's when a polar bear camps out by a seal hole for a long period of time. The seals in this area, they'll maintain about 4 or 5 open holes each so that they can get up to breathe. That's why they've got claws on their flippers to keep these holes open, and polar bears will choose one and kind of just wait until the seal chooses the unlucky hole to breathe out of, and then the bear will dive in and get it. And then we also do see some stalking through the water sometimes also. So seals do rest on the sea ice. They got to take a little break sometimes, and they do stay pretty vigilant, but a polar bear may be able to very quietly and slowly sneak up either through the water or on the ice and then make a run for it and grab that seal. When they are sprinting, polar bears can sprint up to about 30 kilometers an hour. They can't do that for very long periods of time, but for a short period, they're pretty darn fast.
Great.
And I guess I should note just quickly, polar bears they really do need the sea ice to hunt seals. They're really good swimmers, of course, but seals do outswim polar bears in the water. So that's why we need that ice substrate so polar bears can kind of get the seal away from the water habitat and kill it that way. When it's just open water, it's really hard for a polar bear to get a seal.
Yeah, and at Brooks River too, salmon are sometimes very, very abundant in deeper portions of the river. And occasionally people will wonder, well, why aren't brown bears down there trying to get those fish? And it's because the fish can swim away. It's just really easy in open water for prey to get away from bears. So they have to use sort of like topography to their advantage. And that's why we see bears fishing at Brooks Falls so often, is because the salmon have to make mistakes there to figure out how to get around the waterfall, and bears can take advantage of that.
Lisa, you just mentioned the polar bears needing the ice as a platform. So we've gotten a few questions about sea ice. And this viewer asks, I know the melting sea ice is a danger to polar bears as well as other wildlife living in those areas. Are we already at a stage where you could call that critical with respect to their habitat?
You know, that's such an excellent question. I would say we're at a stage where we do need to do something now. And if we did do something now, then we would not get to this, very critical time period. I think the issue with sea ice as a habitat is that when when we're managing other animals or other species that live on land, there's really kind of more direct things we can do. We can build fences or plant more trees, or, you know, adjust grazing patterns of cattle if that's an issue, or, you know, there's these direct things. But with sea ice, we can't just put a border around it, and we can't just grow more of it. So we do need to act now to protect it. And the really cool thing about sea ice is that it's super responsive to the temperature in the ocean and atmosphere. So we know it'll come back. A little lag, but we know it'll come back if we get the warming in our atmosphere under control. So I would say if we could pause time right now, it would still be okay. You know, we've got over